The private sector finds the courage to invest only after the entrepreneurial state has made the high-risk investments. But what happens when the state is in deep recession like Greece? Who, if any, could act in state's shoes?
I didn't see that. Interesting. So the real problem is how to form public and private partnerships. This is not about state versus private sector. And my point is simply that in order to have those dynamic partnerships, we need to rethink what it is that the public side is even meant to do. If it's just about subsidizing and incentivizing, then actually that doesn't create courage in the private sector. So what I've tried to do is look at the direct, strategic, mission-oriented public investments which over history have actually crowded in and even dynamized in the private sector to actually do things it wouldn't have done anyway in the internet, in nanotech, and biotech, and today in the emerging green tech industry. And really, I don't think there's anyone that can fit into the state's shoes if the state doesn't do this. And this is why in countries like Greece, in Italy, in Spain today, we don't have enough private investment precisely because the state has not been actually fulfilling its proper role.
Concerning the big risks that the state takes, you have talked many times about risk and return. What would you propose as a reward for all these massive risks of investment? How could a refund-generating mechanism work instead of raising taxes? Are there any early adopters of this mechanism?
Okay. So first of all, we should remember that when NASA was founded, the National Aerospace Agency in the US, the top marginal taxation rate under a general Republican president was over 90%. So first we should just admit that we no longer have the tax system we used to have. We have also had across the world a reduction in both corporate income taxes and capital gains taxes. We also have a plethora of different types of tax incentives. So really the question is tax currently structured in order to bring back a reward to the state when the state actually does make these kinds of investments that I've been talking about? And here we should first sort of pause and admit that what the state did in Silicon Valley was not just de-risk the public sector, but take an immense amount of risks, which mean also lots of failures. For each internet, there are 7 or 8 failures that we probably don't know about. For each investment it made in Tesla, which Tesla received $465 million in a guaranteed loan from the US taxpayer, there's 8 or 9 Solyndras that were failures that received about the same amount of money but failed. And so the question is, can we rely on tax alone in order for the state to set up a portfolio of different investments where it doesn't just socialize the risks and ask the taxpayer to come in to bail out the failed investments, but also socialize the rewards? And there's different ways this could be done. It could be done through different deals, simply in terms of reinvestment. So when a company has in fact received this kind of, if you want, direct, high-risk, mission-oriented investments, which I've been looking at, it should be part of an agreement where when the profits actually arise, which may take some time, those profits will be reinvested back into the production process, back into the innovation process. This, by the way, was where we got Bell Labs, which was one of the most innovative private R&D laboratories in AT&T. It came out because the government at the time insisted that AT&T reinvest its profits back into innovation. It could also come about, this risk-reward mechanism, through negotiation about the intellectual property rights. I don't know why we call them rights. They're not rights, they're contracts. Patents are contracts, and they should be negotiated between public and private. And so there's no reason that the patents should all go to the private sector. For those areas, for example, medicines that have received so much public investment, there's no reason why the patent should also be part of a deal where the prices of the drugs will be capped, for example. So both in terms of perhaps retaining a golden share of some of the intellectual property rights for the government, but also that if the patent goes to the private sector, the prices of those medicines should be capped so the taxpayer doesn't pay twice. We could also have equity investments. So coming back to the Tesla and Solyndra investment, there's no reason that the US government couldn't have retained a bit of equity in the Tesla investment in order to cover the inevitable failures like Solyndra. We could use income contingent loans, which we do for students, for example. Why don't we do that for businesses? Anyway, there's a whole host of different types of mechanisms through which we could socialize both risks and rewards, but we're not even asking that question, because at best we talk about the government as de-risking or correcting market failures. As soon as we change that conversation and say that government has actually, in places like Silicon Valley, in places like Denmark and Germany and China today, it's taking risks and creating and shaping markets, not just fixing them, then this question comes about.
In your book, emphasis is paid on innovation instead of R&D. Why is this so, given that most of innovation is a result of R&D activities?
So in my book, I talk actually about the decentralized network of different public organizations that have been present along the whole innovation chain. Basic research, applied research, and early stage financing of companies. What we don't emphasize enough is the need for that presence, that committed, that patient, long-term capital across that whole chain, which also, by the way, includes demand-side policies. So it's not just about R&D, but surely those countries that are not spending enough in neither the public sector nor the private sector on R&D will not innovate. But even those that do spend on R&D, that's not enough. There's also a question of how it's distributed across the chain, whether there's enough feedback effects between applied and basic research, which have always been fundamental, whether there's enough different organizations interacting so it can't be top-down policy. There's lots to learn from the Soviet Union, which was actually spending more than Japan on research and development compared to its GDP, but actually grew much less, because what Japan had, which the Soviet Union didn't have, was a system of innovation and a distributed system of innovation. Having said that, Japan, of course, was and is still spending higher than average amount of R&D. So this is not about not spending on R&D, but simply not focusing only on the R&D.
Many times you have argued that what Europe needs today is not austerity, but strategic investments, which will create a dynamic innovation union. What kind of strategic investments are you talking about, and by whom? Is the state, and the European Union of course, capable of performing smart-based selections between investments?
So this is not, again, about the state versus business. We need both public and private investments in innovation. But the problem is, because we've dismissed the role of the public sector, we haven't even thought about the kinds of organizations that we require in the public sector in order to think about innovation. So in order to innovate, you have to be willing to explore, you have to be willing to learn from failure, you have to be willing to fail. And so one of the biggest challenges is actually investing also within our public sector capacity, instead of outsourcing all the brains of the public sector to the private sector, which is an increasing trend. I think it's one of the key cancers in modern day capitalism, that we are outsourcing the brain of the government. And so it also becomes less exciting to go work in a public sector institution. If you're a smart graduate from university, you are more attracted to go work in Google or Goldman Sachs than to become a civil servant. It doesn't have to be that way. One of the secrets of the US government was precisely to have mission-oriented agencies where it was an honor to go work. So the Department of Energy recently was run by a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. There's no Nobel Prize winners running anything in any government in Europe, because we have created a narrative where all the problem is in the public sector, and so there's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we don't ask the right questions of what kinds of capacity building do we need in these public institutions. But also this means being able even to think about the risk-taking, but also what are the challenges ahead. So often I focus on the need of mission-oriented investments, and I use the example of going to the moon, not because we should be going to the moon or to Mars again, but because going to the moon required many different sectors to interact together in new ways, even clothing. It required thinking about a big problem, being kind of crazy. It was kind of crazy to go to the moon, so being willing to imagine, being willing to dream. And today we have a crisis of imagination in the public sector, but then it also had to translate into a concrete mission. So when you went to the moon, you knew when you got there. And this is very important, because missions are somewhere between challenges, which are very broad, but not specific enough, but much broader than, say, just a sector. This is not about just making a list of sectors. And so what we require is public sector capacity, a distributed capacity, not just one big ministry, say, but different types of public sector institutions, which together are able to imagine a new direction for the economy, similar, by the way, to what Germany is doing today with the Energiewende policy, which is not just about renewable energy, it's really about transforming the entire economy in a green direction. IT underwent a similar imagination of, IT beyond just the IT sector. And this is difficult. It's not just about spending more and more. It's about the structure of that spending, the structure of the relationships between public and private, but also the nature of the knowledge creation mechanism within the public sector.
Silicon Valley in the US resulted also because of geographical proximity between top US universities and enterprises and the strong demand pulled by the state. Can this be replicated in Europe?
Sure. The problem is in Europe, for example, we don't really have procurement policies at the level that the US does, and procurement was absolutely fundamental for demanding in, pulling in on the demand side, for example, the purchase for silicon chips. We actually created, in some ways, Moore's Law. It didn't just happen on its own. And the question really is whether this could even just be done nationally, or do we need something like the European Union to facilitate that? And I think we need both. Currently what we have is a dysfunctional situation where we have, on the one hand, in the European Union, a Horizon 2020 program that I think now it's about just under 80 billion euros are going to be spent until 2020 on research and innovation. And yet, in order to stick to the Maastricht criteria and have maximum 3%, now everyone's talking about surpluses, but anyway, 3% deficit, then countries are having to cut the capacity nationally. So even when we spread these 80 billion euros across Europe, if we don't have the actual institutions in Europe that can actually spend that money in a strategic way and interact with each other also in a way that entails solidarity and not this constant bickering between countries, then this European money will actually not leverage much nationally. So Spain has cut its publicly funded research by 40% in order to stick to the Maastricht criteria, at the same time that all these different financings instruments are coming to Spain through the European Union. It's not one or the other, they have to work together. But the biggest crisis we have today in Europe is a lack of solidarity, and that, in my opinion, stems from the fact we haven't really achieved a proper diagnosis of why we have these extreme differences between the core and the periphery. What really makes Greece different from Germany? Is it that Greece has just spent too much and has an inefficient public sector and rigidities in the labor market? Or is it also because it actually hasn't had the kind of public and private investments that Germany has had, doesn't have those same institutions, it doesn't have an active, strategic, mission-oriented public bank giving patient finance to the most innovative companies. It doesn't have the Fraunhofer Institutes, which create these very important linkages between science and industry. It not only has very low research and development spend, but it hasn't been willing to think about the directionality of that spend as Germany is today through the Energiewende policy. We need a very different diagnosis of what is causing the skewed competitiveness in Europe, and only once we get that will these different pots of money that we have, whether it's through the European Investment Bank, the structural funds, or Horizon 2020, will that be able to interact with national policies that reflect these differences in competitiveness and find a solution to actually become a serious innovation union as opposed to a divided one.
I would like to pose you one last question. What are your future plans in terms of research and public outreach?
So I'm very lucky that I am, if you want, addressing, I feel, a thirst of public policymakers around the world, and have had the luck of being invited, if you want, to speak to governments really worldwide and different levels of civil servants, from people working in ministries to the ministers themselves to the presidents. And the problem is that what I've realized is that on the one hand there's this thirst because what I'm providing is a very different narrative. On the other hand, when it comes to the concrete policies, they often continue to be lobbied by different types of arguments that have to do with value creation. So on the one hand, they might listen to what I'm saying, but then they say, okay, but we've then introduced this particular tax policy because this type of business has, told us that this will create more wealth and more value. So I've started to pause and say, well, what kind of metric do you have for value? What do you mean by value creation? And so I'm currently writing a book called The Value of Everything, where I look at how, in order to really understand what's happening around the world, especially after the financial crisis and all this value extraction that continues to happen, speculation, short-termism, and different value extractive policies, what we actually need are not just impediments, things like, the wealth tax that Piketty talks about. We actually need a different theory about where wealth comes from. And so, and I'm trying to do this in such a way that policymakers can understand, to enable them, to strengthen them, to realize that there's different theories of value creation. And by just being presented one by mainstream economics, that has also influenced the kinds of tools that they think are available to them in order to steer growth in the smart, inclusive, sustainable direction.
Thank you very much for this short conversation.